The miracle of the raising of Lazarus is the climactic conclusion to the first half of the Gospel of John, known as the Book of Signs. That period, just 11 chapters, takes up about 2 years of Christ's ministry because there are at least 2 celebrations of the Passover within it, and it's leading up to the third, so it could be 3 years. The rest of the Gospel of John, known as the Book of Glory, takes up only 2 or 3 days and consists of the washing of the feet with the final discourse and then the Passion of Christ. In the Gospel of John, in the Book of Signs, with all the other miracles we see in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, there are, in fact, only 7 miracles in John's Gospel, starting with the first, the changing of water into wine at the wedding at Cana, and ending with the miracle we just heard in today's Gospel, the raising of Lazarus. And we see in these miracles a build-up from a, let's face it, water into wine, a virtual card trick, not all that impressive in the grand scheme of things, leading up to a miracle in which Jesus demonstrates his absolute mastery over death. Now granted, Lazarus will die again, and when he comes forth, he is still wrapped in the bandages and the burial clothes. There is another resurrection from the dead, toward the end of the Gospel, in which the one coming forth is not wrapped in burial clothes, but rather leaves them behind neatly folded. And we see in that the difference between the resurrection of Lazarus and the resurrection of Jesus Christ, which we pray we will follow. But the interesting thing in the stories in the Gospel of John of the miracles, as we hear at the very end, Martha has already believed in Jesus and knows that Lazarus will rise at the resurrection. But after the miracle of Lazarus, it states that many others came to believe in Jesus. And these miracles in John's Gospel bring about a progression of faith in Jesus as the resurrection and the life. But the great irony at the end of this miracle, which is not included in today's Gospel, I think unfortunately, because it does present an irony, is while there were people who, seeing this miracle of life, come to believe in Jesus, the Pharisees, however, because of this miracle, gather and meet and resolve that this man, Jesus Christ, must be put to death. It's at this point in John's Gospel that the decision is made: Jesus must die. Now, part of this reminds me of a minor detail in the second book of the Harry Potter series. Some of you might have read them, perhaps some of you multiple times, which one of the characters, a father of Ron Weasley, Mr. Weasley, comments that in the dual life of the magical world and the Muggle, non-magic world, he's fascinated by how, even in the Muggle world, there are so many signs that magic exists that the people see, but they actually just pretend not to see it. They're so caught up in their own worldview that even something as simple as shrinking keys, they won't say that they saw their keys shrink. They simply say, "We lost them." And they explain away what little indications of magic they see to keep their viewpoints secure and solid and simply deny what's in front of them. The gospel such as today's, where we see some people who see the works of Jesus came to believe in him, at the same time we see others who repeatedly see the works of Jesus and will still ask him, "What sign can you give us that what you say is true?" Or, in the case of the Pharisees, despite seeing what's in front of them, realize he's too much of a threat to be allowed to live any further. Despite what they see in front of them, they have to keep their focus stubborn, denying what they see in order to keep a worldview or a sense of their own faith or their authority intact. And we see that ultimately leads to the cross. But for those who do believe, because of what they see, there is a call to bear witness to what they have seen and their faith in Jesus as the resurrection and the life. And isn't that always the case? And in many ways, still the case. We often see a clash between people of faith and people with a worldview that excludes faith. Among my favorites, there are those who insist that there is a clash and a battle between the church and science. But they deny the very fact that modern science owes its existence to the Catholic Church and faith in God as creator. There really is no war between religion and science, maybe between science and religion, but that's pretty much tantamount to teenagers thinking that their parents are so ignorant. Not really much to it. There are those who insist on a particular worldview that is based solely on their biological functions. St. Paul speaks of those in today's second reading. He says they are people who live and are fixated and focused on the flesh. They are not people who live in the Spirit. And we see a whole demographic in our own society. Their whole identity is based upon their biological functions, their orientations and proclivities and urges. And any religious view is juxtaposed and sacrificed for that particular view because, as Paul says, they live in the flesh and deny the reality of the Spirit that lifts us above our humanity. We can perhaps think of many other examples in which people deny what is right there in front of them in terms of matters of faith in order to keep a particular limited world view. And this is perhaps what Ezekiel is talking about when he speaks of stony hearts. That in opening themselves up to God, He will take out their stony hearts and give them natural hearts. And in doing so, He will bring them back to where they should be, to the embrace of His holy love that is, in fact, the resurrection and the life. During the season of Lent, what do we have right there in front of us? We have the practices, the disciplines, the sacrifices, the penances that we engage in. And hopefully, now 5 weeks into our season of Lent, we can speak of experiencing firsthand the grace of God that has helped us to overcome temptation, to maintain those sacrifices we've committed to, a sense of unity with the church in maintaining those practices that we do together as church, the days of abstinence and the days of fasting. These are things we have right there in front of us that if we but engage in them with an open heart, we can truly experience the grace of God that gets us through this season of Lent, and we can recognize the growth we are called to experience by God's grace during this season. And then there are those who, despite what they have right there in front of them, will still, Lent after Lent, say, well, I don't get anything out of it. I don't do them because I don't see the point. I don't do them because I think they're, man-made rules. One would think these people don't stop at red lights. Man-made rules. But those who do engage recognize what has been handed down to us in our tradition as church, in our practices as church. Recognize the opportunities and conduits of God's grace during this season of Lent so that we can open our hearts of stone, let God give us those natural hearts, let the grace of God go through with us and through it within us, so that at the end of Lent, we can look back on Easter and see where the hand of God has guided us, strengthened us, and helped us to endure as individuals and as a community of faith as we prepare to celebrate Jesus Christ as the resurrection and the life at Easter. And so it's an appropriate gospel to hear, not just for the RCIA, for which this gospel is very important, but for all of us as we come to these last weeks of Lent. Next week, believe it or not, will be Palm Sunday. And in just 2 weeks, we celebrate the Easter Vigil, 2 weeks from tonight. Hopefully this has been a fruitful Lent for all of us, in which we truly see and recognize the works of Christ within us, within our families, and within the community of the church, and in particular this parish of St. Bruno's. That we can not be the people of stony hearts who keep our limited worldview by simply denying what's right there in front of us, but truly open our hearts of flesh to be people of the Spirit, who in virtue of our own baptism, our own receiving of this Eucharist, recognize where and how God works in and through this season of Lent, so that we can, after this 40-plus days in the desert, truly rise with Christ on Easter Sunday as we celebrate Him as the resurrection and the life.